So, good afternoon, everyone. Before starting, I really would like to thank the organizer that gave us the chance to present our research through this webinar and make us feel like we are virtually in Cambridge. So, thank you so much. So my article focuses on indigenous people food security and the eventual legal obligation towards a right to cultural food. And this is an extrapolation of the PhD thesis that I'm writing at Tel Aviv University, Israel. So in an era where food is considered mainly as a commodity, the neoliberal food system, the global food system, focuses more on the quantity of food rather than quality. And with the term quality, I'm not only referring to safe food, but also what kind of food. And this approach is contributing to the destabilization of ethnic groups. We lay on the assumption that international law can defeat food insecurity, just reducing hunger. However, food security is not only confined to the concept of nutrition, but is also owns action range on a psychological and mental level that cannot be solved just increasing the production of food. Indigenous people and indigenous communities set a clear example. The modern food regime, which epitomize biotechnologies and monoculture, are completely in conflict with the indigenous ideology of food as a balanced discourse between humans, spirits, plants, and animals. Indigenous people are the first inhabitants that have lived continuously on a certain territory until now. So after centuries of living in the same reserves or same territory, they have learned the most helpful way to utilize the surrounding natural resources. They handed down discoveries and knowledge from generation to generation. And the indigenous communities have shaped, among other costumes, also their specific culinary tradition that is a mix of natural medicine, ritual, symbolism, and cooperation among the members of the community. So if from one hand, indigenous food provides the basic nutrients that are essential for their health, essential for their lifestyle, for their body microbiome, on the other hand, it represents a way of life to which the members of the community identify. Food patterns have changed during the last decade as indigenous people started or were forced to move from a nutrient-dense traditional diet to one centered on store-bought foods because of relocation in urban areas or expropriation from their lands. For this article, I relied on studies on indigenous people in US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And they all show that as soon as indigenous people have limited access to their traditional meal, not only they face malnutrition and chronic disease like obesity, diabetes, glucose intolerance, gallbladder, heart disease, and so on, they also experience loss of identity, loneliness, and threat to the existence of their ethnicity. In this regard, in 2010, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues reported an escalating process of tribes extinctions, and also this created a risk of losing 90% of the global cultural diversity. Thus, although according to the economic approach, a right to food that is basically focusing on the quantitative aspect of food is more efficient, often this is not enough to protect food security in its most complex meaning. And de facto, the still vulnerability of indigenous communities prove there is a gap in the international normative system concerning right to food that still hinders the achievement of indigenous people food security or even other communities that are not studied yet in the academy. They use medical data and the anthropological studies on the relational and symbolic meaning of food give a reason to consider that maybe a re-elaboration of the concept of right to food towards a right to cultural food could improve the life of indigenous people from different point of view. So the realization of this new right will be justifiable in relation to three fundamental rights and principles of international human rights law that I'm claiming. So firstly, the right to cultural food couldn't be defensible under the claim of cultural rights. The meaning of culture is still debated. For example, Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights show a strict understanding of culture that is focused mainly on the enjoyment of arts and sharing of scientific advancement. However, among the new various definitions, we say that culture is intended as a system of knowledge that is shared by a relatively large group of people. In autochthonous communities, in fact, food does not only converge in the meal that is served on the table. Traditional dishes are only the final result of the process. They are a result of knowledge that is made by use of specific medicinal herbs that are helping, for example, children to grow up healthy, or defeat disease that are specifically in that territory, or even to digest their own food. Or maybe the knowledge of observation of the seasonal fauna and the flora, the performance of sacramental rites, and even the partition of various duties among the members of the community. Hence, indigenous food is representing a specific way of life that carries an intergenerational knowledge on it and distinguishes that specific community from the other ethnicities and the rest of the population. So as a Professor Stamatopoulou, that is specialized on indigenous human rights, even in the UN, states, cultural rights are not restricted to art or scientific exhibitions, but they embrace any aspect of life that promotes development and integrity. Secondly, I claim that if traditional food safeguards integrity, the right to cultural food should be eligible under the protection of self-determination. So self-determination cannot be narrowly interpreted as a secession from the states, as many countries fears. At the contrary, self-determination is the need to pay regards to the freely expressed will of people as the right to live according to their needs, so that justice, autonomy, stability are guaranteed in the remote future. For example, originally Lenin argued that all the minority groups should be able to freely determine their own fate, either through secession, autonomy with the federation, even through the force of arms. And here I'm saying that indigenous people have many times clarified that having access to their lands and food is sufficient to express their sovereignty. What I argue so is that the ability to decolonize their diet and restore their traditional food, have access to their food, have produced their traditional food, become a major component in controlling their own life without invoking any Leninist violence. And finally, integrity demands dignity. So every human being has the right to live a dignified life. We are talking about 350 million of indigenous people in the world, and mainly live in hard conditions. The World Bank has lately declared that 1/3 of indigenous people are poor, and are up to 10% of the world's poor. Usually, more than 50% of indigenous people have diabetes, and indigenous people that live in developed countries have 1.5 times greater risk of obesity than other people that are living in the same country or affiliated states. So this disproportion between indigenous and non-indigenous people, physical and mental health, shows a grave violation of human rights and human dignity. So for many indigenous communities, dignity and integrity subsist when they feel connected with their ancestors. For the majority, the rupturing of bonds with their ancestor, the fragmentation of the relationship between their lands and natural resources, or even the forced desertion of their cultural practices procure a severe suffering that's going to affect their moral integrity. There was a case of the Guarani Kiowa community in Brazil that faced a mass suicide that was 30 times greater than the national average because of the depression caused by the expropriation from their lands. So if limiting or denying the access to traditional food can lead to malnutrition and chronic disease, contribute to the sense of loss and abandonment, then we have obviously an obligation to conform a right that is already existing, like the right to food. to the demand of the individual and the community. So obviously, it's unavoidable to restore food at the center of the human dignity through the realization of the right to cultural food. So to conclude, through the recall of cultural rights, self-determination, and human dignity, I claim that there are all the preconditions to elevate a legal obligation towards a right to cultural food as a means to safeguard indigenous people food security, promote their food justice, and especially guarantee the survival of the ethnicity continuously and in the long term. Thank you so much.